Welcome. Thank you for coming. This is going to be an extraordinary event. No one is going to fall asleep in the next hour or so. Zero. This is timely, and it's utterly appropriate that we have decided at the Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center to award our annual Journalism Award to Maria Ressa. Yes. Let me just run down a little bit of the background of the award so that you know where we're coming from. The award honors the legacy of the late Walter H. Shorenstein, without whose very generous endowment, the Shorenstein, named after him, Asia-Pacific Research Center, would not have been able to maintain the level of scholarship and research and writing and publication and teaching that it was able to do over these many years. Now, annually, since 2002, a $10,000 award, we wish it were more, has recognized outstanding journalists who have spent their careers helping audiences around the world understand the complexities and subtleties of the Asia-Pacific region. I suppose now we should call it the Indo-Pacific region, but that gets us all the way to Africa. The award symbolizes the center's commitment to journalism that persistently and courageously seeks accuracy, deep reporting, long-form journalism included, we don't get enough of that these days, and nuanced coverage in an age when attacks are regularly launched on the independent news media on fact-based truth and on those who tell it. One might even say that, although this is a bit of a stretch, if in the 20th century we worried about the right to speak, perhaps in the 21st century we should also worry about the right to know, the right to hear, the right to see, the right to read the truth. And it's in that context that Maria Ressa was singled out with the following remarks by my colleague and director, Gi-wook Shin, who's sitting over here, and I hope I'm not misquoting him. Maria Ressa is a champion of digital journalism innovation and a paragon of protecting democracy and speaking truth to power. We are honored to recognize her. Now, I am really not, often this is said and then violated by people who introduce speakers, but I'm really not going to go through the details of Maria Ressa's biography, which is impressive enough without my having to mention it, and in any case is summarized briefly in the handout that I'm sure you've all, by now, I hope, read. Maria and I were trying to remember earlier today when I first met her, but I do remember vividly having known her in a sense long before we met because, of course, she was on CNN, and I would go to Jakarta from time to time. I'm I should have said, the head of the Southeast Asia program here at the Asia-Pacific Research Center, and there she would be on the screen. She was bureau chief in Jakarta, of course, also in Manila. Her background demonstrates an extraordinary commitment to these two things that in some respects, perhaps from a purely academic perspective, might be said to be in a little bit of tension with each other. On the one hand, a commitment to truth, but on the other hand, a commitment to conveying the truth. And when you convey the truth, as many academics do in lengthy books that no one reads, full of footnotes, you know, your impact is limited. But if you're Maria Ressa, your impact is fabulous. You know, when we decided to give this award to Maria, we realized that we were not the first people on the planet that had had that idea. And if I had the time, I could go through the list of her awards, which is just absolutely astonishing, including 3 different awards so far this year. I mean, not to mention the ones previously, and utterly, utterly deserved. Because Maria has, in a way, she is the ideal of what a professor desires. Yes, a commitment to the truth, but also, not all professors have this, an ability to communicate the truth. And I can't say enough about her as a personality and as an effective professional journalist at a time when what we need, yes, above all, are journalists who really are willing to speak truth, and not just to speak truth, but speak truth to power. Now, we're not going to spend the afternoon talking about Rodrigo Duterte, but his name has to be mentioned for the systematic harassment to which Maria Ressa has been subjected in the Philippines. Let's not just leave that aside. It's absolutely critical in the context of the so-called anti-drug war, which has claimed by these are official claims, right? These are not being made up by an outsider. The official claims, more than 5,000 so-called drug personalities have been killed as of January of this year. And rights groups estimate it's much larger than that, perhaps 12,000 people. This morning I went on Rappler, and sure enough, on Rappler, there was a story. President Duterte was speaking to an individual who would soon assume a position as a policeman in Bacolod City. Some of you are nodding. Perhaps you saw that this morning as well. And President Duterte told the policeman, and here's the quote, "Go there, go to Bacolod City. You are free to kill everybody." And then there were expletives that were not included on the Rappler site. "Go, start killing them, and I will join you, the two of us. If you are sent to prison, I will go to prison with you." I mean, at the risk of veering in a slightly partisan direction, that language is more than slightly appalling to me, and it brings to mind a whole issue of whether democracy in our 21st century at this point in time is really going to be able to survive the variety of threats directed against it. We will, to some limited extent, talk about that during the panel. But mainly, I want to emphasize how much Maria does combine this intelligence, fierce intelligence on the one hand, with a tremendous ability to communicate the truth to the world around us. And I think I've lived up to my 10-minute limit. I do want to thank very much the one person who was just absolutely crucial to this whole event, and that is my colleague, Noah Ronkin, Associate Director for Communication and External Relations, sitting in the front row. And all of what you see here, the preparation, everything really needs to be credited to her. Now, there will be a panel, but I will not introduce the other panel members because one of them is not here. Larry Diamond is teaching, and after all, teaching is important. Now, some professors might say, well, never mind, I'll reschedule the class, but Larry is a serious teacher, and so he will be here a few minutes late, and until he arrives, I will not introduce him and Raju on the panel that will come after we hear from Maria Ressa. Please welcome Maria Ressa.
Let me just pull this up. Yeah. Got it. Great. Thank you, Don. So I have you for roughly 20 minutes. So please let me know when my time starts to come up. But what I want to try to show you is actually probably three things, right? The three main points are really, what's the problem? Why should you care? The second is why the Philippines? Let's look at this country halfway around the world, 13 hours away by direct flight from here. This country that has been, for the fourth year running, the social media capital of the world. We spend the most time on social media globally. And for the third year running, we've spent the most time on the internet, an average of 10 hours a day. And Christopher Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, he came out, he has a new book out. I won't tell you the title. I think you can Google it. But he said that the Philippines, long before Cambridge Analytica, there was a company called SCL, that the Philippines, because of its 100 million people and because it is a tech-savvy capital, that it is where they test tactics of manipulation. And if it doesn't work, no problem. It's impunity. But if it does work, then they take that tactic, and his word is port. We port it over to the United States and to the West, right? That's why the Philippines. And then finally, the last one is, I don't want to depress you in the middle of the day. let's look at potential solutions and my own appeal to those of you here in this room. And it is so nice to see so many faces, familiar faces here. And my new friend Paolo, who is sneaking out as a nurse to come in. Oh, you, don't say that. And Julian, the guys who are actually Filipino Americans who are bridging worlds like I am. So let me state the problem, and it's in one slide only. That was something I said 3 years ago, this one, and this was a graphic made by Al Jazeera. This is what I saw happening in the Philippines in 2016. If you can make people believe lies are the facts, then you can control them. This was at the end of last year. If you know this guy, his name is Tim Snyder. If you please pick up his book. It's called On Tyranny. It's only 150 pages long, but it's a great way of looking at history and putting in context what is happening to your world today. And what is that context? He says it best. If you want to rip the heart out of a democracy, you go after facts. That's what modern authoritarians do. Step 1, you lie all the time. Step 2, you say it's your opponents and the journalists who lie. Step 3, everyone looks around and says, what's truth? There is no truth. That end goal is to make you not even look for the truth. And then finally, resistance is impossible. The game is over. If you have no facts, you have no civic engagement, right? And what we're seeing happening everywhere around the world is when you say a lie 1,000,000 times, it becomes fact. It replaces facts. And these are part of the reason we have so many, Kellyanne Conway talked about it first, alternative realities, right? This is why there's so many of them. And, the social media platforms actually already took down Alex Jones. I'll show you what's happening in the Philippines. Let me take you to the number 2, the case study. Sorry, why else the Philippines and why me? If you are a journalist and you want to hold the line, you want to protect the rights, in a country like the Philippines, it requires a lot more today than it ever did when I was with CNN 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Today, in about 14 months, I had 8 cases. In 14 months, the Philippine government filed 11 cases against me and Rappler. In a 5-month period, I posted bail 8 times. And early this year, in just a little over a month and a half, I was arrested twice and I was detained once. While I like getting a lot of experiences, the rest I could have done without that, all that does is make me angry. And so I've had to deal with anger management. And the only way I really deal with it is by looking at data. How do you fight back? You fight back by knowing what reality is. And we can talk more about that. Let me show you the case study of the Philippines. Some of you guys will have seen this because I've been talking about this for 3 years. I really feel like Cassandra. This is the global phenomenon, right? If you've heard the phrase patriotic trolling, it's been used by a researcher who is now, she's a feminist researcher looking at disinformation networks. It is state-sponsored online hate and harassment campaigns to silence and intimidate. Instead of just censoring, like in the old days, preventing it from coming in, now they flood the information ecosystem with lies. If you flood with lies, you have no idea what's fact or fiction, right? And on social media platforms, Facebook, for example, did I mention, by the way, in 100 some odd million people in the Philippines, 97%, now it's 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. Facebook is our internet. So this little place, Palo Alto, actually has brought so much positive and lately negative things to my country, to the global South. Flood the market with lies. That's what's happened. Women Our data shows us that women are a favorite, easy target, 10 times more than men. And I'll show you 3 steps in the Philippines through the case of Laila de Lima. She's a senator who's been in prison for more than 2 years. With roughly 6 days in court, she hasn't been convicted, but she was charged with a non-bailable offense and the same tactics used against me. So I speak from personal experience. The first step is to attack the credibility of that person, regardless. Just say they're corrupt. Doesn't matter. You don't need evidence. If you repeat a lie 1,000,000 times, it becomes a fact. If you work for traditional power, you will be told, don't engage on social media. That is the wrong tactic, because if you don't engage, social media wins. The lie will win, right? So the first is attack exponentially. Repeat a lie 1,000,000 times, then it becomes fact. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you cannot have trust. Without any of these 3, democracy as we know it is dead, right? The public sphere is dead. And what I hope you will see is that what's happened to my country, to the Philippines, our dystopian present is your dystopian future if nothing significant is done. Tactic number 2 is sexual violence, particularly against women. Pardon my voice, I'm fighting a cold. You inflame the biases. In the case of Laila de Lima, a video, doctored video of her in a sexual act went through social media in the Philippines, spread like wildfire, no bounds, right? And when you're attacked sexually as a woman, your credibility goes out the door, right? It's an easy peg. Third, this one, they trended hashtag arrest Laila de Lima roughly 3 weeks to a month before she was actually arrested. So think of what's happening on social media as bottom-up attacks, astroturfing, and then what happens is that top-down, once this is like fertilizer, softening the ground, then power comes top-down and repeats the same account. So in Laila de Lima's case, when she was arrested, no problem. Everyone expected it. They tried the trend, hashtag arrest Maria Ressa, in May of 2017, 2 years before I was actually arrested. It didn't trend. That's probably why it took 2 years to arrest me. It's a strange time. All right, so let me show you some of this example. This is May 2017, hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. This is one of the main content creators. There are only 3 at the beginning. This is now the first wave, but now we're past the 6 waves of disinformation networks. In this one, this is the account that's in charge of creating content for the middle class. Rappler, what was this? It was the first conversation between Duterte and Trump. We got a transcript, we published it along with the New York Times and The Intercept. But look at what's written about us. Rappler just made, along with the Washington Post, sorry about that. Rappler just made the Philippines a legitimate target of North Korean nuclear missiles. Laughable, right? People took it seriously. Then from here, that's the first time the hashtag was used, arrest Maria Ressa, on May 24th, and he just happened to be in Moscow on a state visit with President Duterte. From there, it jumped to Twitter. And here, this is one of the campaign accounts on Twitter. Ipatawag na yan sa Senado. Call her to the Senate, hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. I was called to the Senate more than a year later. And then from there, it jumps to a real person, an overseas Filipino worker. I can smell an arrest and possible closure of Rappler.com. Hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. Then we move to the sexual violence, and it's picked up by this guy. Maybe Maria Ressa's dream is to become the ultimate porn star in a gangbang scene. It's not. And then from there, it jumps to another guy. And this is on Rappler's Facebook page. Me to the RP government, more than 4 million accounts, right? Make sure Maria Ressa gets publicly raped to death when martial law expands to Luzon. It would bring joy in my heart. This is a college senior. And when I posted this, because my only defense is to shine the light, right? When I posted that, his school contacted me and wanted us to talk to each other. What do I talk to him about? My worry is that these kinds of astroturfing has an impact on the values of the future. And that's actually what you're seeing happen in the public sphere now, not just in our country, but here, all around the world. It's systematic, and I want to show you how systematic it is. What we did in Rappler is our data privacy laws allowed us to take down, to basically, we're one of Facebook's alpha partners. We were able to take our data and create a database. We call it the Shark Tank. And this is the database of disinformation networks, right? We're one of Facebook's 2 fact-checking Filipino partners. And what we do is we fact-check for the lie, but beyond the lie, we look at the network that spreads the lie. So if you guys are if you guys are spreading a lie and you do it repeatedly, we then tag. It's like a terrorist network for me, right? Because it is. Look at this. From January 2015 to April 2017, our campaigns began here. You can see when the campaigns began, and our president, Duterte, was elected May of 2016. The drug war began in July of 2016, and you can see how the weaponization of social media happened. You pound a fracture line of society, you pound it repeatedly. And you can see here, the 2 words I focused on is bayaran, which means corrupt, and bias. I always add the ED because I'm a grammar Nazi, but biased, right? And it's an attack of mainstream media. The reason why you don't trust traditional media is not just because of media's fault, it's because it's a very deliberate strategy to make you doubt any institution that actually tries to tell the truth. So here we go. These are just the attack words against traditional media. What else? What do I do for my social media team, right? So we had now we have a terabyte, more than a terabyte of data. And what we did to help our social media, because Rappler is a startup, we began in 2012, and part of the reason I don't want Facebook to leave, I just want them to clean up, is because I know the positive part of its power. It is empowering. You're nodding because you know the positive aspect of what Facebook can do in a country like the Philippines, where institutions are weak, right? But we also know what happens when Facebook does the wrong thing and institutions are weak. So what we did here is we took that database and I put it in one chunk. This is a very crude UX for our social media team. These are the URLs that spread the lies, right? So this is actually inside Google's purview. And then these are the Facebook pages that spread the lies that live on these URLs. And then if it's reposted more than 10 times, it turns red. Now, Rappler did the Disinformation, our first propaganda war series. I gave the data to Facebook in August of 2016. I gave them a month and a half to come back with me with either action or data. I didn't get anything. We published it October 1 of 2016. The minute we did that, I got slammed with an average of 90 hate messages per hour. And I want to take you to what that looks like today. This is October of 2016, right? You can see from here, this is what my social media team would do. Did you see how it turned red? We will go to the page of Sally Matay because her page, she attacks all of traditional media. And if you look at what she writes, I say she, obviously this is a cut and paste account. It is a fake account, right? And look at how many times she posts in a day and which groups. The campaign pages is a familiar one, Duterte and Marcos pages. And you can see this is the activity of this Facebook account. I think we can all agree this is not authentic behavior, right? So this is what my team can see. And when they see this, then what they'll do is they'll block it, right? Or they'll report it. This is an attack And I want to show this to you again because these are about networks of disinformation. This is January 2017, and this is an attack on our vice president. Unlike the United States, our vice president comes from the opposition party. And our vice president, Leni Robredo, is a woman. This was an attack against her January 2017. When you see the data looking like this, it doesn't give you much, right? Unless you're really a math geek. But when we put it in a network analysis map, it looks like this. And when it looks like this is the same network that attacks journalists, that attacks me, that attacks Laila de Lima, that attacks activists, that attacks opposition politicians. It is so organized that these three content creators are broken down by demographic. This is a pseudo-intellectual account. I can't say it's intellectual. A pseudo-intellectual account for that supposed thinking class. Then this Thinking Pinoy is an account that caters to the middle class. I showed you what he was the one to try to trend hashtag arrest Maria Ressa 2 years before I was arrested. And finally, this is the main account. She's a singer dancer, kind of like a more aggressive Spice Girls, more aggressive. The Pinoys are laughing. Mocha Uson blog. These two admitted that they worked for government, and she was actually, well, let me show you what happens. This is the foundation of the information ecosystem in the Philippines, right? How else does it move? From that, it jumps to actually traditional media. And the newspaper they tend to jump to, because this account is a columnist here, and because the Manila Times was one of the oldest newspapers, but it's now owned by a man who was just named the head of Duterte's international public relations 3 years ago. So this is, if you read the New York Times magazine, the Manila Times is where they came out with what they called the Matrix, and I was named as a coup plotter. Yeah, let me call my military out to plot this coup, right? So from there, this attack on Leni Robredo then jumped to here, state media. And, you will see if you read Rappler that state media not only did this in April of 2017, they've actually now said that RT will be training state media. So yes, Russia today is, I love the expressions on your faces. Welcome to my world. Yeah. And then finally, let's close that loop by taking this mass-based account, this singer-dancer who campaigned for the president, and in April of 2017, let's make her in charge of social media for the entire government. She held that post until December 2018 when she ran for Congress. She lost, but she's now just been given a government position for overseas Filipino workers. That's my world today. You have your own version of it. We also have historical revisionism. And historical revisionism, like here in the United States, is not just making you vote one way, right? It's not a one-off thing. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Think about disinformation about this landscape as feeding you drugs, right? The first time, this is a KGB chairman who actually said this, and he went on to head the former Soviet Union. He said that disinformatia, or disinformation, actually only the first 1 or 2 times you take it, not so bad, you can go back to being who you are. But if you take it all the time, it's like drugs, right? When you become an addict, then you're no longer the same person. So think about our body politic as that. We're drugged. We're addicted. This is part of the reason we're having the problems with democracy we're having now. I have 5 minutes. I'm going to quickly go through this. I want to show you when the first arrest warrant, you can see 34% of the stories. This is using natural language processing on everything written on the internet. 34% of the stories of my warrant came from the Philippines, 27% from the United States. But what's most interesting is if you topic cluster, take the topic out, and you'll see this. you'll see that the stories that were written in the Philippines, 27% was basically the government's press release. That's the impact of fear. But who carried the Duterte rights crackdown? 17% of this, the red, if you go back to here, is the United States. This is part of the reason I'm speaking to you, because you can speak plainer than we can. And then finally, this is one of the last chunks. This is what our information ecosystem looks like today. You can see this Duterte, the anti-Duterte communities are there. They're very small. The size of the circles are based on eigenvector centrality. But our information ecosystem has been taken over by pro-Duterte and pro-Marcos communities, right? They're extremely powerful. Here's the upside. It basically became 50-50 the day I got arrested, which is February 13th. And, you know, my team jokes all the time. They said I should have stayed in detention longer. But they don't like me very much, my team. Anyway, so look at what's happening, right? The anti-Duterte clusters, they share traditional media. They share traditional media. But the pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos clusters, and you'll see the Manila Times and the Philippine News Agency here, they actively avoid sharing traditional media, and they're actively looking for their Alex Jones. Mocha Uson isn't quite making it, partly because maybe it's not smart enough. I don't know, I didn't say that. Anyway, so coming up on my last, there's hope. Right? So let's talk about, this is Rappler's financial performance. I told you we're a startup. We aimed to break even in our 5th year, which is 2016. We did hit positive net income April 2016. President Duterte was elected in May, and our attacks began in July of 2016, right? Despite that, we did hit positive EBITDA, and you can see the toll that the attacks took on us. What happens when 11 cases are filed against you? 49% of your advertisers drop. The end goal was attrition, right? Kill Rappler by just filing so many cases they can't deal with it. But guess what? We were able to pivot. We found a sustainable business model, and in 2019, we aimed to not just break even, we aimed to cross across and hit positive net income. Here's the part that I think is critically important for news groups today. You need to have a diversified revenue stream. And what we found is, and again, because we're talking about the future of journalism, this was something we were forced to create. It's a B2B model using data, research against disinformation networks. Because guess what? When they're not hired by the government, they freelance against companies, right? So what we did is we've grown that and we've diversified into programmatics. We've strengthened our platform, and we plan to roll out a new platform come beginning of the year. Let me just end with this. This is all connected to geopolitical power, right? We found December last year, when the U.S. Senate and the House Intelligence Committee hearings released all this data about Russian disinformation, the Internet Research Agency, we found our connection to it bottom up. And I'll tweet the link to that article if you haven't read it. We're now seeing Chinese disinformation networks coming into our ecosystem. And this happened maybe 4 months ago and is strengthening, right? We're being fed poison. Another way to think about it is, there's a virus that's being pumped into the body politic, and we are slowly dying. So what do we do? You know, the first is really, this is an easy part of the way I always think about it, which is, you know, our world today, I started with Tim Snyder, right? But here's what we have in the Philippines. Online and offline violence creates fear. People are afraid. Anyone who questions a brutal drug war supports those who fight for truth. They're attacked with the full force of the Philippine government. Our law, in addition to social media, is weaponized. They're cautionary tales for anyone demanding the truth. I'm a cautionary tale. I don't think the Philippine government knows what to do with me right now, which is why I keep talking. And then finally, what do we need to do? I say we start with our area of influence, right? Demand accountability from power. Stand up against bullies. Report the lies. Tell your family and friends. Courage spreads. We take care of what's in front of us. But the systematic solutions, long term, it's education. Medium term, maybe media literacy. But in the short term, it's this little area in Palo Alto where please push tech platforms in social media to do something to stop the lies from spreading. Because lies laced with anger and hate spread faster than facts. I mean, you know it, right? Facts are kind of boring. So let me leave you. Despite this, journalists are holding the line. The baton was passed to me at a really difficult time, and sometimes I really wish it wasn't my time right now. But I have no choice. I'll walk one foot in front of the other. But I want you to hear the other Filipino journalists who are holding the line. This is about a minute and a half.
Have you ever been harassed because of your work?
Yes.
Have you been threatened online?
Ay, oo.
Have you been called biased?
Yes.
Have you been called stupid?
Yes, plenty times. By idiots.
Have you been called disrespectful?
Yes.
Have you been accused of corruption?
Yes.
Have you been called ugly as a response to any story?
Yes.
Have you been called fake news?
Oh yeah, they always say I'm fake news. Anything that's critical is fake, right?
Have you been accused of being an imperialist spy?
Yes.
Have you been accused of being a communist operative?
Yes.
Have you been accused of working for the CIA?
Yes.
Have you been sexually harassed as a journalist?
Yes.
Has your family been threatened, harassed, or alluded to?
Yes, it has. Specifically my daughter. When she died, there were a lot of people who made fun of that.
Have you been threatened with rape?
Yes.
Yes.
No, not me, but my family.
Have you been threatened with violence?
Yes.
Have you been threatened with death?
Yes.
Have you been told how you're going to be killed?
Yes.
Has the violence been described to you?
Yeah, blow my head off or bury me alive.
What will stop you from reporting?
Nothing. Nothing.
Nothing.
Death.
Did you have to kill me?
Fight for your rights. Thank you.
See. I'm not going to actually introduce either Larry or Raju because the main purpose of this event is to listen to Maria and to discuss her presentation and the topic that she has raised. I do briefly want to say one thing about Larry and one thing about Raju. As those of you that are familiar with Chinese history will remember, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a movement, the culture movement in China, and it talked about Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, and they should replace Mr. Confucius. Larry Diamond is Mr. Democracy, not just here at Stanford, but given his extraordinary, prolific writing, including his most recent book, The Ill Wind, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition. We've heard a little bit at the end of the talk about Russian rage and Chinese ambition. So I'll just leave it there. He is an expert on democracy beyond imagining. Raju Narisetti is a member of our selection committee, I'm glad to report. So he's partly responsible for the decision to bring Maria here today. He's at the Columbia Journalism School. They gave an award to Maria earlier this year. And he combines experience in journalism with experience in business with, of course, the academic side in economics as well. So he's a superb addition to the committee and also to this panel. Now, to get us started, if I could, I was thinking before about this event, and I thought, let's think in terms of concentric circles. Let's start with the Philippines and then maybe work our way out, or we can go out and work our way back. But let me begin by asking Maria, okay, perhaps this is a naive question, what if Duterte were not the president? What if there were a president who actually believed in democracy? Would the problem disappear?
Good. Oh, good. I don't have to punch anything. Would the problem disappear? It depends on what you think is the problem, right? I've identified two, because these are two areas where the government has acted with impunity. The first is the drug war. You mentioned this earlier. The United Nations now claims at least 27,000 people have been killed since July of 2016. At least 27,000. The government says now it's a little over 6,600. The second is information operations. That's the other word that we use, where we're manipulated. It's quite insidious. If another government was in power, would they have the drug war? Well, none of the ones who campaigned. There were 5 candidates. President Duterte was elected by 16 million people, or roughly about a third. He didn't have a majority. There were 54 million voters in the May 2016 elections. So no, I think that, what we've seen globally is really the perfect storm. We have disillusionment with liberal democracy because it hasn't brought enough to the mass base. In the United States, you started as early as, the 1%, the 99% versus the 1%. In other parts of the world, in the Philippines, even though our GDP kept getting better and better and better, our poor were not feeling the effects, the trickle-down effect wasn't working. So there's that basic fundamental problem, right? There was something wrong with democracy, but technology became the accelerant that pushed the elections of these populists all around the world, who then, in many countries, then twisted it and used the power they already had. I'll say one thing that Cambridge Analytica's whistleblower, Christopher Wiley, said. He said that they walk into countries, into these elections, and they don't actually charge a lot for the candidates who they're working with. What he said is they go back later on after they win, because then that candidate who they helped win has the ability to give them lucrative government accounts. If you read it in his book, you'll see the same thing said.
So it sounds like there are corruption issues. There are issues that really confront a number of countries in the world. That this is definitely, I mean, quoting you, you said, you, namely the people in the audience, presumably most of us American citizens, you can speak plain than I can. That may be the case, but technology in particular is now sweeping the world. I mean, I came to Silicon Valley when techno-optimism was at its height.
Yes.
And now the backlash is really clear. So maybe our colleagues on the panel would want to jump in and comment on the extent to which, first of all, this is a technological problem. I suppose, second, whether it has a technological solution. I mean, would artificial intelligence, if you had the right algorithms, solve the problem? Or is that naive, kind of old-fashioned Silicon Valley thinking?
Well, thank you, Don, but most of all, thank you for Maria for your courageous, innovative, and intrepid work. You're just an inspiration to all of us and a very important global figure in the struggle for democracy and civil society and press freedom. I think it's naive to think, Don, that there's a purely technological solution. But it's also naive to think that we can rein in these alarming developments without addressing their technological elements and the economic incentives underlying the technical elements. You begin with this. Why is Facebook doing this? Why is Facebook facilitating this? We talked about this earlier when we met before this panel, but I think it's well known to most people. Facebook is not, I don't think, intrinsically evil or desirous of having a world dominated by this kind of disinformation and ugliness. It's just amoral. And like most companies, it's driven by, Mark Zuckerberg can testify in flowery freedom of expression language all he wants to the example of Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, and the struggle for civil liberties. But in the end, Facebook is a private corporation which seeks to maximize profit. And the profit logic of social media companies, it's long since obviously been established, is to addict people's attention to their platforms and sell more ads. And what addicts people's attention to an online platform is outrage, sensation, unfortunately violence, dogmatic attachment, political intensity of conviction and attachment, and various other forms of not very savory attention addiction. And the algorithms that all these social media companies use to elevate or demote content seem to still really allow this to be the leading principle. And if they are trimmed at the edges by concern about hate speech, obvious falsehood, or inducements to genocide, as with the Rohingya minority in Burma, it's a secondary consideration and only under massive pressure. And so if you don't address the technological element, which is deeply embedded in the non-transparent algorithmic formulas that are permitting and accelerating, like fuel on a fire, literally, these dynamics, and only occasionally trimming them back, you can't address this problem. If you don't address the organizational elements of it, which Facebook has been saying for a year now that it was going to do with the creation of an advisory council to vet content and make hard decisions about what survives on its platform and what gets taken down, what gets advanced and what gets demoted, then that's probably not going to be possible either. But we're still waiting for the advisory council. And the advice Facebook got to detach itself from the appointment and operation of the advisory council that I think Mark Zuckerberg has pledged to announce soon, I don't think the company is going to take, because they don't want to lose control. And I'll just come to the final obvious point. That leaves government regulation. I just think there's no way around it. And we can talk about anti-monopoly practices and tough decisions, but we can't leave these companies to regulate themselves. We need in the United States the Honest Ads Act, which Zuckerberg kind of reluctantly threw in the towel and endorsed soon after the full measure of the 2016 election scandal became apparent. But we just need a lot more. We're going to need to radically rethink all aspects of this, and I guess we'll chew on a lot of this. There's got to be a macro-political element of response to this, which obviously has to involve advanced liberal democracies condemning and drawing boundaries around the murderous authoritarianism of Rodrigo Duterte and imposing consequences of this on this, and not allowing his manipulating the specter of, well, you know, we've got China here, We can go to China and, you'll be left holding the bag. That's not so popular in the Philippines, according to public opinion. And I think we should call his bluff on that. But Japan, the United States, Australia, and the European Union need to do that in the Philippines and elsewhere in these countries. So we need a macro political response. We need the kind of civil society response and press response that Maria is mobilizing, and a lot of resources internationally flowing into support of that. We need an organizational response and in the business platform and around it, and we need a technological response.
Raju, do you want to?
I knew we would get to Facebook. I just didn't think we'd get there so quickly. So I think it is tempting and perhaps accurate and easy to blame all of this on technology and platforms, but the reality is, fake news or false news has been around for a very long time. An example I usually use because of where I sit in New York is that in 1911, a very respected publisher who used to run a tabloid called the New York World was accused of causing the Spanish-American War by making up stuff. That publisher turns out to be Joseph Pulitzer, whose name is now attached to the highest quality, best journalism, and I sit in the Pulitzer School in the building. So fake news and kind of bad journalism has been around for a long time. Clearly, the ability of a Facebook or a Twitter or TikTok or all these guys to create virality out of that has made the solutions really wicked problems. I mean, wicked problems are not a non-technical term, by the way. You should look up wicked problems on Wikipedia, and it tells you why these problems are very hard to solve, and there's no easy solutions because it is a bit of a whack-a-mole. You hit something and something else goes wrong. But I think it's interesting to remember that there used to be Putin, there used to be Castro, there used to be the military government in Myanmar, and a bunch of maybe dictators out of the ex-Soviet Union who used to be the real enemies of press freedom, and they would do it in very blunt ways, censorship and all of that. What has changed, I think, in the last, I would say, a decade, and Larry knows a lot more about this than I do, is this notion of elected, relatively open elections, heads of government who are now actively kind of capturing media in ways that are very hard to discern. And whether it's Erdogan in Turkey, who got a bunch of his friends to buy up all of the media, whether it's Orban in Hungary, where the ruling Fidesz party now owns 87% of all media in that country, or whether it's Modi in India, where they have very effectively used the fact that the government is one of the single largest advertisers in media as one of the ways to effectively capture media. I think now we are seeing the spread of popular elected governments. I mean, Duterte won re-election, at least in the local elections, very handily. So how do we deal with that? We could solve for Facebook, and some of these people are using Facebook as a means, or WhatsApp, or some of these, but they're using other conventional methods. Take Modi in India, for example. The first 5 years of his government, he did not hold a single press conference. What he did was, he had 30 million followers on Twitter, and he did a bunch of direct things. You see parallels there. Trump does the same thing. This White House hasn't held a press briefing for months now. And I think some of the techniques that they're using are fairly similar, and those are not going to be solved by going after Facebook. So I think this has to have a holistic view, and I think that's what Larry was kind of talking about. The solutions need to come from multiple areas. And to directly answer your question, sorry it took so long, I think technology is great. We must remember that technology has value, but it has no values. So how we use it, right? AI can be used to create interesting stories out of sports, events, and creating it without using people. Or it can use deep fakes, where the senator in Philippines was shown as having an affair and filmed and all of that, right? That's a complete deep fake. So I think it's a matter of who is using it and how they're using it.
Maria, would you like to comment?
Yes, I think just 3 things, because you brought up so many interesting ideas. The first is that, yes, I think there are 2 things we need to address, right? The first, by dealing with Facebook and other social media platforms, and the next one in the Philippines is YouTube, right? By dealing with them, you stop the supply, right? So it's like stopping the supply of, like, let's just say your drug-addicted body, right? So you stop the supply. But then the second part is, how do you then rehabilitate this body politic that has been addicted to lies? So those are the two things, I think, and I agree with Larry, the macro-political response is extremely important. The same way that the response of journalists in the Philippines is to publish the press release of the government, because that's the safe way to deal with it, right? The second one is, you have to know that this is like, it's like post-Holocaust or post-World War II. An atom bomb has exploded, and it is so insidious that we're not even alarmed because we don't know an atom bomb exploded. Actually, at one point, I was thinking of starting the presentation with an atom bomb. Why? Because think about it, post-World War II, the world came together, and it wasn't just governments, it wasn't just just civil societies or militaries. You had Bretton Woods, you had NATO, you had the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The world came together to protect humanity from the worst of humanity. And that starts with principles. And the biggest game changer right now is Silicon Valley, is technology. And what are the principles that govern technology? We don't know what those are, right? There's none. There are no values, which is part of the reason you can pick up the New York Times yesterday and look at how lies are as okay as facts, right? That an advertiser, that they will accept lies and allow it to spread and get paid to spread a lie. When, you know, in the Philippines, when I was head of news for the largest television network, we actually prevented ads that were lies from running in the largest network in the Philippines. And then I think the last one is the social media platforms, let's call it what it is. These are behavioral modification systems, right? The technology has gotten to the point where it has all of our data, and what they're selling is not just, you know, the kind of, what I gave you is a landscape. I'm comfortable selling the landscape, but I don't have your individual data where I can say, hey, Don, you buy this point in time for this user, because if you do that, you will get what you want. Artificial intelligence, the data is so massive now that it's the Minority Report. We can predict it, right? And what they're actually selling, and this is to Russian disinformation networks, to others, powerful people with money, they are selling that point where your behavior can be modified. And we've voluntarily all been part of that. We are Pavlov's dogs, and we don't know it. So I guess, I'll end with Raju did say, our midterm elections was 2019. And for the very first time since the 1930s, not one opposition senator was able to win a seat in the 12 seats that were up at our Senate. And part of that is, again, look at our information ecosystem. If your information ecosystem is corrupted, you cannot have a functioning democracy. Sorry, I will contain my anger now.
Can I make a couple of points? It isn't true, I mean, in fairness to Facebook and the others, that there are no principles. Actually, there are some, and they're embedded in Facebook's policy of content moderation and in the now 20,000, maybe more, content moderators that they claim to have, human content moderators beyond the AI ones. And they publish reports on what they take down, and like a shocking proportion of it, the vast majority, 90% or more, is nudity and pornography. So they've got, they have that value. And then they do claim, and I suspect they are to some extent, removing hate speech, particularly any speech that is openly celebrating or condoning or invoking or calling for violence, and most especially, obviously, organized violence against minorities like the Rohingya. This is what they claim, anyway, are their values. Now, we can certainly then evaluate what they're doing and see to what extent they are successful in adhering to their values. But the point you're making, Maria, still stands. Apparently, truth is not a value. And it's just kind of out there in the ether that, you know, no one can really be a neutral arbiter of what the truth is, and therefore that won't be content moderated. And this is now, I think, the core point that needs to be challenged in the following ways. Number one, Facebook and YouTube and all these other platforms, they're not Hyde Park in London or White Plaza here at Stanford, where the First Amendment freedom of expression permits anybody to get up there and say virtually anything. They're also not, you know, ABC, CBS, and NBC in the old era of regulation under the Federal Communications Commission. There's something else, again, but they are closer, I think, at this point to a public utility than to Hyde Park. And they need to be regulated as such, and they need to be held to higher standard as such. And the second point I'd make is that we have to find a way to have some kind of neutral vetting and affirmation of some minimal standards of truth. Or in the end, free expression will die in a different way. And that, I think, is the major logical flaw of the position that Mark Zuckerberg and the other that follows from everything you were saying, Maria, and the logical flaw in what the Silicon Valley companies claim to be their approach now.
Before we open it up, any comments on that, or should we just open it up? You were...
Raju, do you have anything?
A lot of times the debates around what to do about Facebook kind of go in a bit of a circular way, right? We want them to be better at what they're doing. We don't want Facebook to be the ministry of truth. I must say that I trust Sheryl Sandberg more than I trust Marco Rubio to come up with right laws out of our Congress or Senate, right? So there is that tension between, do we really want the government to be doing this as well? But there are some practical steps, I think, that we could propose. I think one of the biggest reasons why Facebook can stay as powerful as it is that the ability to port the data out of our own data out of Facebook is virtually impossible, right? It's very hard. So that's something that the government could say, that's saying that you should open it up where somebody wants to leave with their data, 100%, you should allow them to port it to something else, right? That's a very simple regulatory, Facebook will fight it tooth and nail, but that's a solution. Just as we resolve tax disputes in this country with like a special courts that act pretty quickly and just focus on tax issues, it is possible that we could have a system where there's a data or privacy courts, right, that deal with those issues. To Larry's point, I agree. I mean, they could create a panel of outsiders, but as long as they're all reporting into, if you will, and expecting Mark Zuckerberg to then kind of make those decisions, I don't think that is going to necessarily work. So there could be some effective solutions. I also think that it's important for us not to abdicate the responsibility of media companies in this, right? Take the US, for example. When our business was suffering, one of the first things this industry cut in this country was they stopped all media literacy programs. They ended newspapers in education. They did a bunch of things that have actually caused some of these problems to come about, right? So an effective solution, I just read that the FCC is looking at the Gannett merger. One answer is to say, if two big media companies are merging, you need to put aside X amount which we can invest in media literacy. So I think there could be effective solutions to solve for this problem long term than just obsessively focus on Facebook.
I'll just respond quickly to what Larry said. I agree with all, except for this one part, which is actually what Facebook, what technology has done. I think what we've seen is this, they have stated values, but the values as a whole, the existence of the platforms, atomize meaning, right? So look at it. What's content moderation? Here's a list of 100 factors that are moderated by content moderators, and ironically, for the longest time, the two countries that had the largest numbers were, one was in Poland, in Warsaw, the other was Manila, in the Philippines. And, you know, what they've done is, there are all these things that have no intrinsic meaning, so you have atomized meaning. And that's part of the reason you had a Filipino content moderator take down the Napalm Girl, the photo by Nick Ut during the Vietnam War, right? Taken down because it had no context. So it's replacing context. It is taking away meaning. It is taking away authority in many ways, right? Earned authority. So when I say no values, I mean replace content moderation, and I'm only going to echo David Kay, who's the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. He said, use the UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? Use that. That has values. And then the atomization, only a tech person will think that you can take this very nuanced way of being a gatekeeper as a journalist, where we spend our entire careers learning how to do that with standards and ethics, and then drill it down to an itemized list of things. I'm not a big fan of the Supreme Court version. I don't think it's possible. I think that the major idea that you can drill it down to a list is just wrong.
Then I think we've accomplished something, and thank you once again for coming. And above all, thank you for the panel, and thank you, Maria.